Okay. Professor Carey, we've had an interesting discussion about Marshall McLuhan. I was wondering if you would like to say something that you feel represents your view of what Marshall McLuhan's contribution has been to our thinking about communications, technology, culture, and historical and social change.
Well, the first contribution, and it is a much larger one, I think, than people normally estimate, is that he allowed us to see interconnections between things which heretofore had been thought of separately. As far back as the invention of the Carolingian text in the 6th century, to the development of phonetic writing in the West, to printing, on through television. So people can now, in fact, write books about comparative media or media ecology or the relationship between the technology of communications and social change in a very wide historical envelope. These heretofore had been subjects which were the province of the classics, or of literature, or philology, or history, or comparative social organization, but had never been seen together in a mutual relationship to one another. And that was, in a general way, an extraordinary achievement and breakthrough to summarize that and to set out, therefore, an intellectual agenda. Secondly, he saw that there were concrete interrelationships within every historical period, not across them, between modes of apprehension, between what we're able to see with our eyes, hear with our ears, apprehend with our other senses. I was sitting last night watching a very great play, and suddenly, because it was a play that demanded that my eyes roam the stage to pick up the different cues as they were staged in different places, and I suddenly realized my head never moves in the movies, nor do my eye move, because the camera is my head and my eyes. It has incorporated me into it. So in the theater, my head and eyes move. I control aspects of the apprehension, and I have to actively cooperate with the playwright in order to gather what's going on. In the movies, not at all. The camera is my eye. It is ocular in quite a different sense. It's visual in quite a different sense than the theater is. So all of a sudden, McLuhan taught us we could see differences between the theater, television, motion pictures, literature, as they existed within the same historical era, feeding off one another into the ways in which they engaged our apprehensive capacities, our capacity to see, to know, to understand, to hear, and to interpret. And those were extraordinary insights. He wasn't alone in having them, others did, but he had them, and he had them concretely, and he gave examples of them, and he propelled forward the whole body of thinking. And for those things, and there are others that could be mentioned, but for those things alone, we will remain in his debt. Now, I had said earlier even that there was a downside to all of this, and that downside came about because as he developed and expressed these views, he also put them within a kind of mythological context of the great march of technology across the soil of North America, a particular vision of progress and human development and perfectibility, whatever his private reservations might have been. And that, I thought, was, in the context of the 60s and beyond, a less attractive aspect of what he did. And it was at that point that my own more critical relationship to him took hold.
You mentioned McLuhan and the 60s.
Yeah.
McLuhan really rose to great heights in respect to his reputation and one would guess influence during the 60s. Would you reflect on why you think that was the case?
Well, I think there was one very large reason. There are a number of specific ones that related to very particular events that occurred over the course of the decade. But the larger one was, and because everything has to have a date, I'll give it one, 1967. We entered the last third of the 20th century. It is, I think, a general rule that in the last third of the end of a millennium, thoughts turn to what lies ahead. And so that in 1967, we started to have an outcropping of a variety of apprehensions of the new century, now close enough ahead, within the lifetimes of the living, to start speculating of it. We established the Commission on the year 2000 in the 1960s. For the first time, people who called themselves futurists appeared and started to write books about the future, in which the future was now located in some known point off in time. These things appeared in fiction. Thornton Wilder's The Eighth Day. The eighth day were the children who would be born to the next century, the century beyond Genesis, beyond human imperfection. And in part, the generation that came to maturity in the 1960s, free from the past, heirs to the future, a new breed of human beings, unstained by the sins of the culture or history, were the agent to remake this, to bring us into a new era. This was found in a wide variety of figures, technical, philosophical, literary, of which McLuhan was an important central focus. And indeed, a literature grew up around him. Those forms of prophecy do not appeal very much to me, but it seems to me they're an inevitable part of thinking in millennial ways. And to think in millennial ways relative to the transforming effect of technology as the instruments which open the gateway to the future, which realize it in terms of the present, was in the American grain, or in the North American grain very much. And that, it seems to me, was his larger place in the culture of the 60s. And it was often in relationship to other authors with the same visions, if you will, or the same impulse that we read him and understood him.
If McLuhan was in some way functioning as a prophet, was your work with McLuhan in any way prophetic for you in the sense that it led you in certain directions? Are there lines of continuity between your research and work with McLuhan and what you found yourself doing over the next 35 years?
Well, yeah, there are lines of connections that ran in both directions, both to try to understand what it was I thought that he had come upon, an understanding of how you might make both historical comparisons among media and comparisons within the same time frame, across media within the same time frame. And that I've continued to work upon since then. Secondly, there were negative examples. That is, it set up in me a search for, if in the last third of the 20th century, McLuhan was writing about electronic communication and television in this way, in this prophetic and eschatological way, was there any parallel in the last century? When people started to write about the future in 1867, as opposed to 1967, did they start thinking about similar things, saying certain things, bring to it the same apprehensive capacity? Or to put it another way, was there a way of understanding television, and at that time, the beginning of what you might call post-television technology, computers, the internet, satellites, everything that was on the horizon. Was there a way of understanding that by looking backwards at the 19th century and saying, well, this is pretty much parallel to what happened in the 19th century. The scale is larger, the technology more sophisticated, the hopes may be even more resonant, but nonetheless there are broad parallels. That part of the work was an attempt, in a way, to oppose McLuhan's prophetic views of history with more realistic ones, while at the same time the matter of trying to understand the interrelationship between the media of the 19th century, the telegraph, the railroad, highways, the printing press, magazines, were parallel to trying to understand what he did in understanding media when he put side by side motion pictures, radio, television, the contemporary forms.
What was specifically interesting to you about the Telegraph that made you focus your attention on it?
Well, I started out focusing my attention not on the Telegraph, but with another kind of question. And that was, if I wanted to see today, if I had the resources and the time to see today, what satellite broadcasting and computers were doing, what effect they were having, where would I look? And my thought was, well, I'd first of all look at airlines. That the computer and the airlines grow up together. One can't be understood without the other. I'd look at the banking system, particularly the growth of an international banking system. That is, there are a number of sites that I thought that one might see this, so that one wouldn't have to talk about computers and satellites generally as an abstract force, but as a concrete force, how it remakes the banking system, how it changes its structure of airlines and notions of mobility. I said, if I were to look at the 19th century, the parallel would obviously be the telegraph. Where would I look for that? Well, instead of the airlines, I'd look at the railroads. I might look at the banking system, but I'd also look at the stock markets and the commodity markets. As I went back to the 19th century to study the railroad system and the commodity markets as a way of understanding the telegraph and the parallels between the last part of the 20th century and the last part of the 19th century. So that the interest in the telegraph was always an interest in today, but in settings distant enough, somewhat simpler and clearer, that one might gain some insight into the contemporary by looking at the historical. And that's where the origin of the telegraph interest comes from.
When one first reads your article on the Telegraph, one might speculate that its direction is really to describe a change in the way that different transactions are executed.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you read it through once and you read it through a second time and a third time, you begin to grasp the fact that what you're interested in describing, it seems, is a reconfiguration of culture and even of the perceptual apparatus of individuals living in culture.
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk a little bit about that and perhaps even reflect on any ways in which you see some kind of analogous proposition as one might apply to our present age?
In the case of the telegraph, let's take a very, very simple example. The great attraction of the telegraph to people in all fields was that it drove down what economists call transaction cost. You incur a transaction cost whenever the flow of money or merchandise is interrupted in some way. Now, how do these interruptions occur? If a truck gets stopped at the border, if a railway has a break of gauge so that you have to transship from one to the other, if you go from one place in which one set of property laws, insurance requirements, liability stipulations operate, to another place with a different system of law, making that movement, getting over that hump, getting over the border, adds a transaction cost. That is something in addition to the pure cost of production, transportation, and accounting. The telegraph was a way of battering down transactions cost. It said, there are, if we take the full country as it became realized early in the 20th century, there are 48 states. There are 48 different systems of law. We need one system of law to govern all interstate commerce so that you don't have to worry when you move merchandise that you are going to encounter different things. So we nationalize the law. We've got to have one uniform railway gauge, no longer the Pennsylvania Railway on one gauge, the New York Central on another gauge, the Baltimore, Ohio on a third, all on the same gauge. That is, wherever the telegraph encountered a barrier, it said, flatten it, eliminate it. It imagined a borderless world, except the world it imagined was the United States, not the globe, the United States, in which any existing border hemmed in around a state, a region, a culture, a language, a technology was eliminated. So that now all of a sudden, if you were in the telegraph system, it made no difference where you were. You were all in the same place. The place was the telegraph system. You might be tapping a key in Omaha, Nebraska, but it's no different than tapping it in Atlanta, Georgia, because you're tapping into not a system of separate states, markets, provinces, regions, laws. You're tapping into the same place. So the telegraph created a canopy which it tied to the underlying railroad system, in which people no longer lived, I exaggerate, in the United States. They lived in a system of social relations in which there was a uniform culture dictated by the intermarriage of a system of communication and transportation. So that the transaction costs are the key to see a change in the apparatus of understanding. The spatial map of the United States became not that outline we're familiar with. It became the map of the railroad system. For those were all the significant places. And if you were off that map, you were not connected to where the central armature of transactions was going on. And over those interconnected routes then flowed an increasingly uniform national system of economics, of politics, of culture, of human relations, for it did not respect the differences in regions. Looked at from one side, this was a gain. Transaction costs were down. Everything was available cheaper. What you could at one time only get in New York, you could get in the remotest provinces of the country. And on the other hand, you had a loss in the sense that the rich regional diversities that were part of the original system of creation were therefore whittled away into what was a more uniform culture. So the telegraph became an instrument, in other words, of reconfiguring not economic relations and then political relations and then cultural ones, but reconfiguring them all simultaneously. And on the other side, it did it because it was based on a code, the first binary code. Dot and dash became the lingua franca of the telegraph system, just as plus and minus, 0 and 1, is the lingua franca of the modern communication system, of the computer. It translated everything that was real, that is to say, into a dot and dash, which could be a simulation of the underlying structure. That became my real interest in the system, how there was a globalization of the 19th century that was limited geographically, though if we talked for a while, we'd find out, well, it also included the British Empire and the railway and telegraph system of it, which were well integrated into North America. That is, we globalized in the 19th century, too, in battering down these barriers, but we battered them down with a somewhat simpler, somewhat less flexible technology.
In reading your work, you refer, on one occasion, to the Grundrisse, and
Yeah.
I get the sense from some of the language of the article that parts of Marx were very important to you.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you would extend that part of the article a bit for us. Give us some sense of how important and what parts of Marx were really important in helping you to shape your view of the Telegraph.
Well, there is, in the Grundrisse and other places in Marx, an argument about the nature of markets and their development and their transformation during the 19th century when he was writing. I've said in the past that Marx was a great economist of production, not so great an economist of distribution. That for him, analyzing the surplus value generated out of the factory system and the return to ownership was the central thing to look at. What I want to look at is more the development of markets in transportation and communication rather than as sites of production. But there was one very important notion in Marx, and that was the notion of a commodity fetish. And the way I understood that notion was this, to make an easy historical analog, is that if goods were to be exchanged at an earlier, pre-capitalist phase of history, it always involved a farmer Moretti bringing his product to market to exchange for the products of craftsman Carey. That is to say, these were sets of face-to-face relations between people in which the objects had personality in the sense they were products of your labor and my labor. They had our signatures upon them. And they were mediated because we bargained, haggled with one another to establish some mechanism of exchange. In the 19th century, as the size of markets expands and expands, again, under the influence of the telegraph and the railroad, now all of a sudden, on the one hand, first of all, I'm dealing with Farmer Moretti, who I've never seen, and have no idea under the conditions in which he produces what he does. In fact, for all I know, he produces this with serfs or slaves or through conditions of exploitation and brutality that I would never permit were I to see it face to face, but it's distant and remote. So all of a sudden, the signature is taken off the product. the signature being both how it is made, the conditions of its making, and the imprint of the personality of the maker. So now when I go out to buy wheat or corn, I don't buy Farmer Moretti's corn. I buy grade A. I buy it on a futures market, which is a combination of all the work of many different producers. So by distancing people in space and time, all of a sudden, the commodity appears as if an abstraction from history. No human labor is visible in it, and no human personality. The diamond comes up out of the mine, but what do we know about the conditions of the miners? The garment comes out of the factory, but what do we know of the women who make the garment? Labor is doubly alienated here from a perceptual process. It senses that it no longer controls the product because its signature is not on it, and the conditions of its own work are alienated, for they're no longer seen. That struck me as an extraordinary insight into how we live, and something that comes about not just because of production, which may remain relatively the same, but because of distribution, because now the market includes a city, a state, a region, in which buyer and seller, worker, producer, and consumer now meet anonymously through mechanisms of exchange and not with any reality. And so we have to try to recover this. We have to go back and try to find out, how are the Nike sneakers really made? What are the conditions in the factory in which Kathy Lee Gifford has her clothing line manufactured? Because we can't walk to Lower Manhattan and see it anymore, relatively speaking, for it's done halfway around the globe. It's beyond this. I think that notion of the commodity becoming something different in history as it becomes disembodied from real people was one of the great insights, and a human insight, not just a mechanical one, a human insight into the way the world was developing.
I can sense from the energy that you put into that description that it's very important to you, and frankly, it's been very important to me too. I was wondering if you'd be willing to reflect on what you think it does to the person who purchases the object. We're talking about distribution, but they're also the consumers. Mm-hmm. So if you create commodities, you also create some kind of new entity that's called a consumer. Mm-hmm. And what relationship that has to changes in the way that we construct our communities or the nature of democracy?
Well, I mean, partly it does it in pretty much the way I've tried to say, is that our lives concretely remain dependent upon the activity of others whose daily life supports it, but who are now perceptually invisible to us. They are not seen. To some degree, they're not even seen if they're living with us. The lights go on. No one's out there turning them on. Right? The garbage disappears. Someone takes it away. The streets get clean. The food appears in the store, as if by magic. As if there's no human agency, all the way from people in factories and fields down to power plants who are there. and one develops the illusion of self-sufficiency, that this is all done through the medium of money and nothing else is necessary, until the garbage workers go on strike and we start wallowing in our own filth until there's no place to put the garbage because no one will take it anymore from us. So that it contributes to a kind of, on the one hand, psychological isolation, and on the other hand, to the notion of a psychological individualism. I'm master of my own fate. I can do it myself. I only need the technological apparatus around me in order to support my life. And these are depersonalized objects that don't harbor human labor. And that becomes one of the most difficult problems of modern politics, is to create some sense among people that they depend upon one another, that their lives are interdependent, that they're going to sink or swim together, not alone. And yet that reality is so far away. The kind of rhetorical power and imagination, let us say, it takes to convince a person living in a very advanced society that their lives are dependent by poor, ignorant peasants throughout the world. It's very hard to do.
So it's something of a paradox. We invent communications technologies that one would think naively would increase our capacity to understand the complexity of the world and create greater connectivity between one person and another, and that essentially where we find ourselves, by virtue of the way those technologies have been applied from the telegraph on, we are actually at greater distances from one another in respect to the way that our minds perceive things.
Yeah, that may well be true. There may be an adage that goes, that's an adage really of Harold Innis, that every improvement in communication makes communication more difficult because it distances. I mean, it seems to be collapsing together, but because it enormously widens the scope within which it occurs, it distances at the same time. It brings people into our field of dependency who are physically, geographically, and culturally remote. And we don't become aware of them until there's some revolt out there at the margins, or in here at the margins within, of people who may be physically connected but are not culturally connected. I mean, the importance of that goes back to, for me at least, it goes back to what I said before. This notion that we were going to create, I'll put it another way, is that in the 19th century, if we just take a portion of the globe, we created a globalized society through the structures of very large nation states and through the tentacles of imperialism. I don't say imperialism as an evil word, just for a description of the fact that the extended nation of the British, which reached into most corners of the world, was tied together with the United States and with other European countries by a compatible system of communication and transportation, so that people, information, and goods could move along it with relatively low transactions cost. And therefore, late in the century, we had movements of people, movements of commodities and money, some of which we have never come back to. That is, we moved, as I remember it, 1/7 of the world's labor force, working population, between 1890 and the time that immigration was sealed in the mid-1920s. We moved amounts of merchandise in the world in 1913 that were greater than we moved in 1984. We moved amounts of capital in the world in 1913 that were greater than we moved in the 1960s. That is, the total amount of global human activity was greater than it was for much of the rest of the century. But that period of globalization ended when the guns of August went off in 1914. When all of a sudden that system was torn up in war. In effect, a war that went on from 1914 till 1989. World War I, II, the Cold War, all were part of it. And therefore, the slow recovery of globalization over that period of time. Now, one might also say is the second period of globalization ended in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. Whether the consequences will be so devastating, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a Cold War, or the interregnum will be so long, 1914 to 1985, depending upon how you measure it, but from early in the century to late, we don't know. But the argument I would make, and this is the argument against McLuhan and the literature on communications and technology of the last third of the century, the argument that I would make is there are very, very strong parallels between these two systems of global communication. One powered by the telegraph, the railroad, high-speed navigation, the steamship. The other, larger in its arena that it ingested, powered by satellites, computers, jet aircraft. A roughly parallel phenomena with roughly parallel dangers attached to them. So to go back in a way to the earliest part of our discussion, it was Innes's ability to understand the growth of these global markets, which are also global cultures and global polities, and to understand the deep tensions and contradictions and dangers within it that made his way of looking at things much more attractive to me than the equally insightful but too prophetic notions that I found in McLuhan.
You are an educator and a journalist, and a theoretician of journalism,
Yes.
a historian of communications. Given this separation and dislocation of the individual from the effective context of political action, that is that we as citizens have a hard time knowing the implication of any single purchase. What do you think we as educators and those who are responsible for education writ large can do, might do, in order to address this issue?
Well, I wish I had some sweeping answer to that. I mean, I wish I had the key to all that. Well, I don't know. I suppose that I would start by saying I would teach a truth that we largely ignore and forget. That goes something like the state, politics, is a work of art. It is the greatest human work of art. It is. greater than the computer and the electrical grid and the internet. It's greater than the economy. It is ultimately the construction of a political order with the institutions necessary to make it function, which is the great human creative achievement. Now, in some sense, my only answer is I go back to teaching politics. Not in the sense it's taught today, you know, as an invidious art or as a statistical art, but as creating the institutions of habitable societies. There may not be ways, any more than there were, for example, in the 18th century. There may not have been ways then for the people who created what became the United States to put the citizens of New Hampshire in touch with the citizens of Georgia in some way. But there were ways of creating institutions which managed and harmonized their differences, by and large, with big exceptions, and allowed for a functioning society which maximized certain things, degrees of individual freedom, material prosperity, political participation. And so for me, it remains the task. Billy, we have a great experiment before our eyes going on. We'll have to see, will it be a success? The European Union is now governed by 80,000 pages of regulations. Surely this will not work. No one can read an 80,000-page constitution to figure out what it is. So they're going to have a constitutional convention in Europe. They're going to have to do in Europe today what was done in 1887 in the United States. And we'll see them try to build out of this long period of warfare and national ethnic animosities, a working political system that harmonizes without erasing the differences between these several national cultures.
Time out for a second. You meant 1787, right?
1787, yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a way we can, because that was a good.
Did I say 19 or 18?
Wait, let me get a sip of water.
Take a break, and if there's a pause, if there's a way, would you backtrack a little bit to pick up?
Just go back and say, in 1787 in the United States. Excuse me.
Are you on a two-shot right now?
I'm on a two-shot. All I need is just silence with everybody. You can say it like 2-3 times in a row.
Remember what it was? A constitutional convention like the one in 1787.
Yes, I mean, I was talking about Europe at the time, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Are we rolling? The Europeans are trying to the Europeans are going to have a constitutional convention, just as was held in the United States in 1787, in order to reduce these 80,000 pages of regulations into a working constitutional order in which the differences among these peoples are harmonized and preserved at the same time. You may work that
Let's stop 2 seconds, okay? I just want to talk with Jim for a minute.
Okay.
Okay, glasses are okay though, right? Gerard,
Yeah.
He took his off. Should I take
Well, they were only reading glasses, but I
Okay,
wear them all the time anyway.
okay. It was quite clear, let me start again. Are you ready, Jerome? It was quite clear in your article that on the one hand, Marx was important for certain concepts, but you telegraphed to borrow an expression, a sense of the distance and difference between your perspective and his. And I was wondering if you would be willing to extend your description of the places of difference between your perspective and Marx's.
There are 2 points of difference that have always mattered to me, anyway, in all the political struggles of the time. The first was on Marx's placing priority upon the economic, from which I think in the long run there's little to be gained. Because the relationship between the economic and the political and the cultural, which strike me as usually 3 faces of the same human condition, and therefore I think that they have to be considered together. Let me go back to the Telegraph to illustrate what I mean. If the United States was to be held together in the 19th century, and this was something deeply desired of that time, they were American nationalists in that sense. There were 3 things that had to be accomplished simultaneously. Surely one of them was they had to create a market that integrated the economic activity of producers and consumers wherever they lived within this space. But they simultaneously could not integrate such a market without also building a set of political institutions that would contain them within a cultural framework that was acceptable. That is to say, within a set of practices that struck those people as realizing their ambitions as to how they should live together. Many different countries have produced great amounts of wealth, but they produced them under much different circumstances in terms of productivity and natural resources and infrastructure, and based upon quite different conceptions of property and social relations. And so, for me, the matter is that where Marxism is weak is in assigning both a causal and a historical priority to the economy, and not considering, or in considering then, politics and culture as being derivative or superstructural to it. I think that that view has been one of the things that has led to many of the difficulties of the 20th century, which is if you can take care of the economics in some way, you'll take care of everything else. No, cultural differences persist. Political arrangements that satisfy criteria of rightness, moral appropriateness remain in the face of many different kinds of economic relations. That also then says at the same time is that I'm a Democrat, small d. I believe in democracy. And I believe that that is what has to be given priority, not productivity, not wealth, not economic growth. And I believe that finally Marx's absorption into the economic led him to fall in love with his enemy, led him to fall in love with the object of his critique to such a degree that the democratic potential and possibilities and the political arrangements necessary to sustain it receded from view. And it was also, as that understanding fell upon weaker minds, that much of the carnage of the 20th century resulted. I'd said earlier, the task is to find institutions that allow for reasonable levels of economic productivity so that people might live longer, have better health care, have some of the benefits of having the burdens of labor lifted to them, but to do so within a set of institutions which maximize, insofar as possible, equality and liberty and other virtues we wish to maximize. For me, what makes, insofar as the United States is a great country, it's not because of its wealth, it's because of its democracy. And the moment that its wealth gets in the way of it, then the economic system has to be reformed in terms of democratic practices. And because of my commitment both to the sense of the way in which real life is interrelated in all its moments and not easily separable, and in those interrelationships, the priority has to be given to democratic practice, that I find myself often in tension, if not with Marx always, with Marxism, with its own historical trajectory.
Taking your basic principle that if the moment is such that the means for producing wealth interfere with our capacity to practice democracy or to advance the practice of democracy, do you think we've reached such a point at this present time?
Well, I would trade more democracy for less globalization. I say that simply because while it may be possible in the long run to build transnational institutions that are democratic, and perhaps that should be a long-run objective, it's not a short-run possibility. And therefore, one has to find mechanisms, all of which will involve sacrificing certain amounts of wealth in order to maintain democratic practices. I'll give you an example. The fact that the United States was the most successful economy of the 1990s, it may not be, incidentally, of this decade. That may well be China, which is something one ought to think about. Its rates of growth are higher than anyone else. But we were the most successful because there was an asset bust in Japan, which crippled its economy. And within Europe, two remarkable experiments were undertaken. One, to shift wealth from rich countries to poor countries, so that Ireland grew as Germany was relatively stagnant. The same mechanism we used in the United States to shift wealth from New York to Mississippi, incidentally, early in the 20th century. That even though you never equalized it, it was proper within the framework of democratic practice to redistribute wealth in space to try to produce greater equality. And secondly, because Europe had to absorb the East. And both of these things were enormous drains on its own economy. So, the virtue of that. One of the paradoxes of American wealth now is that it's not tied to redistributive mechanisms. We don't engage in globalization in order to send money to poorer countries, though the long-run effect may be to raise the standard of living of those countries, but they don't exist with us within the same political framework. Now, to pull back from that, to pull back to other policies, would be to slow the rates of economic growth in the United States and the total amount of wealth. But I think in general, you'd need a lot of specifics and qualifications, that would be, it is a good idea to discipline the economy by democratic practice rather than to discipline democratic practice by the market. And that would be the reversal that I would favor.
a slight shift in
Yeah.
gears. In your work on the Telegraph, one of the crucial changes that you talk about is the movement from a space-based economy
Yeah.
to a time-based economy.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you would like to look back and perhaps extend some of your reflections on the concept of time as it relates to these issues.
Well, I do so. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the second one, though? I wrote down landformats. He said there were no debates. He said they're all conservatives.
Israelis think CNN is biased against them.
I know they do.
That's the network they really despise.
Well, that Michael Holmes has done.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
One of the curious things about the development of the Telegraph is its relationship to time. As I develop it in that article, time was kept prior to the Telegraph, community by community. Each town, city, county had its own time based upon the point at which the sun was directly overhead or the shadow on a sundial was at its smallest point. That was 12 noon. Now that meant that the time of adjacent towns, cities, and counties was different because it takes a certain period of time for the sun to move. So that the whole entire country was a crazy patchwork work of times. New York time and Philadelphia time and Boston time and Washington time were altogether different from one another. One could not tell from one's clock in New York what time it was anyplace else without doing astronomical calculations. This made the railroads very unhappy. For as they started to move across state lines, they could no longer coordinate their schedules. They had to put them on the time of each stop along the way. They couldn't figure out when the railroad was going to arrive, but worst of all, the people in the towns couldn't tell what time the railroad was to arrive. If it was the New York Central, would it be New York City time or Albany time or Erie, Pennsylvania time or Cleveland time or Chicago time? Which clock governed its behavior? So we created a uniform system of time in the 19th century as a necessary part of governing space, the creation of standard time and standard time zones. First of all, only important in big countries like the United States. When you have a country like England where there's only 1 hour variance east to west, it's not terribly important. But when you have that much variance in sun time, as you do on the American continent, having a grid of time so that you could precisely tell what time it is every place in the country and coordinate activities became very important. We are now in the process, very early on, of creating a global time system, of doing away with AM, PM, night, day, Eastern time, standard time, so that there will be one time accessible at each point in the globe. Let me cut for a minute. We talked about this last time. We didn't?
No.
We didn't?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, all right, then we go back. The proposal is still in its
Hold on a second.
Are you on two or one?
Now I'm on two.
You're on two?
well, it's in the very early stages. There now are proposals to tell time by a beat system, which would reduce the globe to 500 beats. You would look at your watch and not say it is such and such a time, AM or PM, daylight saving time or standard time, Eastern time or Midwestern time. You'd say it's 440 beats. It's 440 beats here. It's 440 beats in Tokyo. It's 440 beats in Zurich. It's 440 beats in Sao Paulo, wherever you go. Globalization means the globalization of time. And therefore, it permits a clock which gives literal meaning to the phrase 24/7, 365, in which activity is continuous throughout the cycle of the day, the week, and the year. Don't tell me it's Passover or Christmas. It's summertime or wintertime. The time is regulated by the global flows of human activity, which transcend all local particularities. So central to technological development and communication has been the development of telling time, in which the standards of time are themselves variable and related to structures of human purpose that create them and to carry them out. If in the 19th century people rioted when Vanderbilt's time replaced God's time, as they called it then, what kind of protest will we have when the grid of national time, which is essentially what we live in now, is absorbed into a grid of global time?
It's almost a cliche among historians of communications that no medium or modality ever dies, it just undergoes transformations as it's recontextualized through time.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you might be interested in reflecting, which will take us back perhaps to a little bit to McLuhan and his interest in orality, but on the whole question of orality and how it, although it seems at a distance to remain as a constant that doesn't change, does it in fact not change? What is our relationship to orality in the oral world today, and how is it different historically from what it has been and had been?
Let me make a very, very crude and rough distinction between three phases of orality. Phase one is the historical moment when all language is incorporated into the body, which is to say, into memory, when people are suffused with language in the sense that they incorporate the language fully within their mnemonic structures, and they perform language. They don't so much speak it, enunciate it, or reflect on it, is they perform the tradition of stories, of tales, of legends, of apothegms, which are the distillation of the collective wisdom of the culture. These are very attractive cultures from a distance and absolutely unlivable up close for their cultures of dominion or domination. They are cultures in which, to put it too crudely, the elders of the tribe incorporate unreflectively culture into the next generation to prevent deviation from the oral norm. And while we have much to learn from that, from language in that register, in the mnemonic, the embodied register, and it's a great weapon, as I said some time ago in this interview, against forces which try to control the self, it's inadequate. The second phase, one might say the great flowering phase of the oral tradition, is what we think of as the Greek tradition of discourse, dialogue, and argument, which require two things simultaneously: a lot of words in your head, a lot of resources fully internalized so they're accessible but subject to critical interaction with others in a process of testing, revision, argumentation, extension, retraction. This is the oral tradition of democracies. Democracies are structures of memory and remembrance. They place emphasis upon their founding as the moment they came into being in real historical time, and they constantly rework that tradition, which they retain, to adapt it freshly to the circumstances of the present. But to do that, then, the head has to be full. You can't very well critique democracy unless you know a lot about separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, the genius of the founders, the notions of history and posterity. And in that sense, democracies place great emphasis upon remembrance. Totalitarian states are states of forgetting. In the opening chapter of The Days of Laughter and Forgetting, McLuhan Kundera says that the major power of tyrants over men and women is the control of memory. And so the third phase has been, in fact, what you might call subjecting the memory to technological control, which in our case is not the control of technology as such in the normal sense. That is of brainwashing, but is the control of not remembering anything, of not remembering last week, last month, last year, 2 years ago. The political slogan of the day is, it makes no difference what you say in politics. No one will remember. The very overload of communication creates the ground conditioning for forgetting, for nothing is memorable. Not only is nothing memorable, nothing is made memorable, for it impedes, in fact, it becomes its own kind of transaction cost in the structures of modern communication. So we have not yet, insofar as we want democratic institutions, transcended the need for oral discourse, memory, disputation, argument, all of which depends upon the command of a spoken language and the command of the imaginative resources to make it effective within social life. Enough. That was not very good at the end, but that's the best I can do today. Or ask me another question. Maybe I can figure out a different way of saying it.
Well, I was going to ask you about if the oral poet was, in a sense, an instrument of a kind of collective consciousness embodied in language that was in fact embodied in him, mm-hmm. and a politician in ancient Greece or even ancient Rome, for that matter, with greater consciousness, mobilized the best of a tradition to give expression to a position that to some extent was rooted in his capacity to communicate his own character as the guarantor of the argument that mm-hmm. he was making, the ethos of the speaker. Mm-hmm. Have we lost any capacity to rely on individuals in any way to do anything because of the aggressive mediation that occurs between the person who is the presenter and the person who is the recipient of the presentation? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that you have the formats of organizations like CNN. You have multiple speech writers who are between any politician and the audience. You have the visual construction of the way in which we experience these people. We have people dressing other people in order that they appear a certain way. It seems like the rhetorics have almost been distributed now to a whole series of people that are in between the people who are, in fact, the people who pursue debate in public, and almost give me the feeling like there's no real reason to believe anyone. And when I do believe someone, I suspect I've been fooled.
Well, I mean, perhaps one way to say that is that this may be a way of connecting with it. When I think of the notion of postmodernism or the postmodern in relation to truth, I think of it as making this kind of a claim in the extreme, that there is no possibility of uttering a false claim, and there's no possibility of uttering a truthful one either. That properties of truth and falsity are properties of another era. It makes no difference what you say. You say anything. You don't like this idea, I'll give you another one. You dispute me on that, I'll give you another fallacy. Right? Those were McLuhan's responses. And he articulated something he didn't believe at all for the first time, a kind of postmodern version of the truth, in the sense that the utterance had no relation to the utterer. It was purely theatrical, in which the question of whether he believes what he's saying, is making a truth claim what he's saying, or just filling the time with what he's saying, become equivalent things. I mean, in my cynical moments, and I have few of them, does it make any difference what the president of this university says? He'll say a different thing tomorrow. No one will say, but what you're saying today is not what you said yesterday. He says, I got to get through today's meeting. I got to get through today. Words are moments to manage occasions. They make no claims outside themselves, either on me as something which reside in me, or on you as something you should believe. Their existence is momentary and evanescent. They come from nowhere in the past, and they go nowhere in the future. Now that's what I think a postmodern attitude toward language is, in which the speaker and the speech are divorced as fundamentally as the speaker and the hearer. I don't care if you understand me at all. I just want to get us through this hour. So you can go your way, and I can go my way. Now, I go to the extreme, of course, but I'm also trying to capture a moment in the theatricalization of language when it's the product, in your example, of speechwriters and costumers and arrangers, all of which are merely appearances of the stagecraft of politics, but no longer root themselves into values, programs, ideologies, beliefs, the old language, the older language of political discourse. And that's what leads me back to go back to the earlier question of the relationship of language and democracy as having a kind of intrinsic nature that is neither the pre-modern memory arts in which tradition takes over the whole person. So I don't speak the poem speaks through me. I don't sing the music sings me. and the postmodern one that says it doesn't make any difference what the poem is or what the music is. It just fills 3 minutes of airtime, 30 minutes of television time, and if it gets us through that, we ask no more of it, morally, aesthetically, or politically.
Would you say it's fair to say that if you were to look at your divisions through the lens of class and education, that the greater probability is that this is a dirty little secret that is really the understanding you get from an elite education at this present time in America, and that the people who actually still have a naive belief of the truth and are much closer to the dynamic democracy you would talk about are ironically the victims of the system that you describe?
I smile because the question asked me to reveal my bad side, and I'll reveal it with a story. I'm working now on a remembrance of a colleague who died 4 years ago, but who a university is honoring. And in writing out my remarks, my mind drifted back to a night. It was the first Earth Day. When was that? 1968, probably, too. And that evening, we got together to give the first Earth Day speeches. And a biologist stood up and delivered this blistering personal attack against my friend. I mean, called him every name you could conceivably imagine. The evening ended, and we went off to the reception. It was held at someone's house. My friend walked up to the biologist, punched him in the mouth, and threw him in the swimming pool. Everyone asked me to condemn my friend, and I said no. The man deserved to be punched in the mouth and thrown into the swimming pool. That's what a civilized person does, because language counts. What you say means something. That there is a notion of giving offense. There is uncivil behavior. And there are consequences that attach to it. Now, if words don't mean anything, who cares what's said? And therefore, the notion of norms of usage becomes erased. Not because we're free and liberated, but because we don't care anymore. Because language has been detached from the human life world, from its consequences in the real life of real human beings. The trouble with elite education is that I don't get a chance to throw my students in the swimming pool. And their problem is they don't get a chance to do something vile to me if I mistreat them. We call the ombudsman, because we no longer can deal with the real consequences of our actions through the mediations of ordinary human life. And that is a fatal weakness, always needing to turn to the state, even if the state's offices are here in Low Library, to deal with what is the normal flow of human events and experience when language counts and we're called to account for it, not somewhere else, but in the immediacy of its own happening. It's a way of saying, in a sense, that the relationship between language and the life world, people, has been changed, and that there is a real recovery effort that has to go on. Enough?
We can continue the conversation.
Yeah.